بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Inshallah, in today's class we will start by the discussion of the fourth of the four articles or the four pillars of qiyas, of analogy, which is to talk about the illah, the ratio legis, which is, as I said, is really the heart of this entire discussion of analogy. If you can understand the illah, if you can understand the ratio legis, the reason behind certain rules, you'll be able to understand pretty much not only all of qiyas, but you'll be able to understand all of usul al fiqh, ijtihad, fatwa, etc. So, we will begin by the definition of the ratio legis, and then we will look at eight. We will look at 8 types. He says that the ratio legis can be, and then he will give 8 examples. And of course, with all of these examples, I'll do my best to give you actual examples from the Quran and the Sunnah that are lifted from the commentary and the Hawashi literature. And then following that, we will look at identifying. Let me just look at the book here so I can get the concepts. We're going to look at the conditions for, so we're going to look at the types of the illah, then we're going to look at the conditions for the illah, and then we are going to look at using an illah even if you don't know the wisdom behind it. So we're going to make a distinction between what the illah is and then the wisdom that the illah might give us. So those are 2 different things. And then we are going to look at what is called al-illah al-qasira, or how do I translate that? Or we're going to look at the, of course I can't find it right now. The limited ratio legis. I apologize, the limited ratio legis. And then we are going to look at, can you do illah through names and derived, the ishtiqaq, the derivatives from the Arabic language. And then following that, we're going to enter into the rules of connecting something, ilhaq, connecting something to the ratio legis. Now, obviously, we'll only be able to do 2 of those 6 because of the time of the lecture. But those are the main topics, inshallah, that we're going to discuss, and we'll begin as we usually do in the next clip, inshallah. So we begin the way we normally begin, which is to turn directly to the Arabic text, and we say, Bismillah, qala al-musannifu rahimahullah, wa nafa'na bi'ulumihi fi ad-daraini amin. So Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari, he says, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him, and may we benefit from his knowledge in this world and in the next. Al-Rabi'u al-Illa. So the fourth of the 4 articles, or the 4 arkan, integral parts of analogy, is the ratio legis, al-illah. So we're going to be using the word the ratio legis because that is an exact translation, legal translation of the word illah. Al-illah is the reason behind the law. The reason behind the law in Western law is the Latin phrase ratio legis. You can see ratio, the reason behind the law. So because of its, it's one of those unique things where the word just is perfect in that sense. So we're just going to use that, and then that's something that you need to learn. And since this is a law class, at the end of the day, it's okay that you learn and memorize a technical term. الرابع العلة الأصح أنه المعرف وأن حكم الأصل ثابت بها. The ratio legis, the dominant opinion, is that it is what defines the ruling, and the ruling of the original legal issue is established by it. The reason he phrases that is that sometimes some of the other, like the Mu'tazilites or some of the Hanafis, they'll say what defines the ruling is the ruling itself, or what defines the ruling is the text, the textual evidence, the Nas in the Quran and the Sunnah. Here, this is a little bit more, if I may be a little bit more polemic, this is a little bit more accurate, because you have a ruling, there's an engine behind that ruling, there's a heart behind that ruling. Why is the ruling haram, or why is the ruling halal? Remember, in law, we're dealing with a judgment on our actions. In Islamic law, an action can either be something permissible or not permissible in varying degrees, the 5 ahkam that we have. So to say that the reason behind the law is its ruling, or the reason behind the law is its textual evidence, it doesn't really give us what we're after here, which is why. You have to answer the question, why is drinking alcohol haram? Why is drinking alcohol, or why is eating pork products haram, etc.? Why is trade permissible? Why is prayer obligatory? Things like that. That answer is a little bit deficient. So that's why the majority opinion goes. It says this: the dominant opinion, okay, so dominant opinion is that it is the rational legis is what defines the ruling, and the ruling of the original legal issues established by it. That means when you have the illah, you have the ruling. When you don't have the illah, the ruling is suspended. And the reason we say that the ruling is suspended is because the ruling is خطاب الله المتعلق بأفعال المكلفين. It's the eternal خطاب الله is the eternal uncreated speech. Don't say it's Allah's speech. You have to also say it is His eternal and uncreated speech. What else is eternal and uncreated is the Quran, because it's Allah Ta'ala's eternal kalamullah al-qadim. It's Allah's eternal and uncreated speech. So therefore, any khitab of Allah, any speech of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala is eternal and uncreated because it's part of His one of His attributes, Jalla wa Ala. So just trying to help you I want you to start to see how all of the sciences that we're studying, they weave into each other and they kind of combine. So even though that's something we talked about in the theology class, it comes in here. So a ruling, the definition of the ruling in the Sharia, in Islam, is Allah's eternal, uncreated speech as it relates to our actions to do or not do. We took this definition in this book, I think in the first module even, in the first module. So, therefore, when the illah is there, which we're saying it defines the ruling is there. But when the illah is not there, we don't say that the ruling vanishes, we say that it's suspended because it's Allah's eternal uncreated speech. So there is no vanishing of that which is eternal because there's no end to it. So we say that it's mu'allaq, it's suspended, which means theoretically if the illah comes back, then the ruling will come back. So that's important so that you have kind of a 360-degree understanding of how to talk about these things. Okay, and then he says, وَقَدْ تَكُونُ دَافِعَةً لِلْحُكْمِ. The illah could be preventative. It could prevent the ruling. So, like the example he gives is the iddah, which is the waiting period either for a divorced woman or a waiting period for a widowed woman. It prevents her from marrying somebody else. So why don't you get married, oh sister so-and-so, now? There's a illah that prevents me from getting married, which I am in my iddah, I am in my waiting period. أو رافعة, or it could remove the ruling, like divorce. Divorce removes the permissibility of sexual intercourse between man and woman. So the default is that sexual intercourse between the genders is haram. That's the default natural ruling. And then nikah is the illah that allows that act to take place. And then with the divorce, it reverts to its default ruling. So in this case, the illah is removing the ruling. I lost my place, of course. رافعة أو فاعلية لهما, or it could be a combination, or it could be both. Like wet nursing. Wet nursing prevents marriage in certain relations. It prevents and it lifts the possibility of marriage to the siblings who you are married to. وصفا حقيقيا ظاهرا منضبطا, an actual description, apparent and definable. Like foodstuffs have riba in it, so it's the foodstuffs. Foodstuffs is the illah there. It's a description that's apparent and definable. أو عرفيا مضطردا, a non-changing custom. So alcohol being called nabidh, or nabit as we say in the Ammiyya, but it's nabidh is the fusha of it. That's something that's not going to change, that's ongoing. So that means that would make it haram. So I have this list in the translation, and in the book it's like one line, so I got to keep finding where I am. وَكَذَا فِي الْأَصَحِّ لُغَوِيًّا, likewise in the dominant opinion, it can be a linguistic description. Um, sorry, let me go back. Number 5, عرفيا مضطردا, a non-changing custom. These are customs that are not going to change by time, place. And then a linguistic description is the example of nabidh. I read the two wrong. Number 7, وحكم شرعيا, or a sharia ruling. So this is haram because there's another sharia ruling that makes it haram. أو مركبا, or it can be a combination. And usually you're going to find a combination of these things, like discretionary punishments, ta'zirat, or al-qawad, or like when you have non-injurious crimes, and then you are able to do the qawad, you're able to have the injurious crime against the person who perpetrated against you, or when somebody is executed because they killed in voluntary manslaughter. So all of those are basically, the illah there is murakkab, of a combination of the things that he just made. Okay, so let me just read them really quickly. The illah can be preventative, number 1. Number 2, it can remove the ruling. Number 3, it can be both. It can prevent and remove the ruling. Number 4, it can be an actual description, apparent and definable. That's usually the kind that we're after in Usul al Fiqh. Number 5, a non-changing custom. So there are customs that just don't change, and there are, or they don't change over, like, centuries. So since we're not going to live longer than 100 years, wallahu alam, that those apply. Number 6, in the dominant opinion, it can be a linguistic description. So why is this beverage haram? Because it's alcohol, or like spirits, or I don't know. They have all these funny names for alcohol. I mean, for us, it's just all khamr, it's all haram. But those names could be the reason why something is haram. So if somebody came into the masjid and say, Maulana, what's the ruling of spirits? Be like, that's haram to drink. What's the ruling of consuming spirits? Haram to drink, because the name is, we know what that name is. Number 7, a sharia ruling. So something is haram because another ruling. So another ruling becomes the illah to it. And number 8, obviously a combination of one or more of these things, which is probably what we'll find. We'll pick up the discussion in the next clip, inshallah. All right, so after talking about the 5, 6, 7, 8, after talking about the 8 types of illah, now he's going to move on and he's going to talk about the conditions of the illah. وشرط للإلحاق أن تشمل على حكمة تبعث على الامتثال وتصلح شاهدا لإناطة الحكم ومانعها وصف وجودي يخل بحكمتها. So he says the condition, what are the conditions for ilhaq? Ilhaq is the verb, if you will, of qiyas. So we said that we have the original legal issue, the ruling, that's 1. Number 2, the ruling of the original legal issue. Number 3, the branch issue. And number 4, which is the glue of all of that, the illah, which is what we're talking about. The illah. Now, when you find all of those pieces, you have to actively put them together. What is the verb that describes you actively putting them together? Ilhaq. You have to connect one to another. So ilhaq is what you're going to find a lot, that word used often in the discussion of analogy, of qiyas. How do you put those pieces together? The point is that we have a original ruling, right, that we know a lot about, and then we have this new issue, or we haven't really heard about it before. How do you connect this to this ilhaq? What's going on underneath the surface is you've identified the illah and the ruling, therefore, of the original legal issue, and then you are going to make an argument that that same illah exists in the new or the branch legal issue, and then you're going to connect them together, ilhaq. So what are some of the conditions for that? The conditions for connecting it to the illah to other legal issues is 1, he's going to give us, I think, 3 examples. So number 1 is that it contains a legal wisdom that can be used as an example when making the analogy, and it can be cited as the example when citing the ruling as it consumes it or encompasses it. So, the wisdom is a secondary product of the illah. The wisdom is not the illah. Many people that make mistakes in ijtihad and make mistakes specifically in qiyas is because they have misidentified the wisdom as the illah. The illah is the reason behind the law. It's something that's clear, as we will come to see. Will we get into that? We'll get into a little bit of that. Well, sorry, in tomorrow's lecture we'll talk more about that. But it can't be something hidden and elusive and only I know it and you don't know it and I can't really tell you about it. That's not the illah. The illah's got to be clear. Remember the hadith of the Prophet أَرَأَيْتَ الشَّمْسَ, he said, do you see the sun? عَلَى مِثْلِهَا فَاشْهَدْ. As bright and as clear as the sun, so should your testimony be. So when it comes to matter of law, we try to be as clear as possible. Now, of course, there are parts of law that are difficult and elusive and gray area, as we say. And that's why we have differences of opinion. But that's not out of our choice. That's because some issues are complicated. So we try to find and make the illah clear. The illah is not the wisdom. The wisdom, for example, one of the things he talks about in the example is al-qisas. You know, if somebody kills somebody, then they'll be open to a punishment. One of the wisdoms behind that ruling is that knowing that, you're going to be more careful not to injure people or not to fight with people because you don't want to inadvertently cause someone's death, which would then lead to your own death. Now that's a wisdom, okay? That's not necessarily the illah behind it. So one of the things that we say about in ilhaq is we say the condition for connecting it to other legal matters is that it contains a legal wisdom that can be used as an example. So it can be used, doesn't have to, it can be used as an example when you make the analogy, and it can be cited as an example when citing the ruling because it encompasses it. So there's ihata, the wisdom encompasses the ruling as you are considering it. Okay, and then number two, ولا يجوز في الأصح كونها الحكمة إن لم تنضبط وكونها عدمية في الثبوتي. And sorry, I missed the line. So let me go back. The condition for connecting it to other legal matters is that number one, it contains a legal wisdom that can be used as an example when making analogy and can be cited as the example when citing the ruling as it encompasses it. The prevention of the ratio legis is an actual description which prevents the ruling. So why can't this person receive zakah? There's an illah that removes him from a category, he has enough money or something like that. Okay, and then number two, he says, وَلَا يَجُوزُ فِي الْأَصَحِ كَوْنُهَا الْحِكْمَةَ إِن لَمْ تَنْضَبِطْ إن لم تنضبط كونها عدمية في الثبوتي. And in the dominant opinion, it cannot be a wisdom which cannot be defined. Okay, so if you can't define the wisdom, then it's not considered a wisdom. And number three, ويجوز التعليل بما لا يطلع على حكمته ويثبت الحكم فيما يقطع بانتفائها فيه للمظنة في الأصح. And in the dominant opinion, the ratio legis cannot be the absence of something. So if you have the absence of something, you can't say, I rule on this because of the non-existence of something. That's not how the qiyas works. So qiyas is, that's another type of thinking, like a mafhum al-mukhalaf or something like that. But in this case, an analogy can't be on the absence of the illah, obviously, because then the whole thing is about the illah. Okay, now he's going to talk about another topic, which is the limited ratio legis. Just make sure I'm on the right page. Okay. ويجوز التعليل بما لا يطلع على حكمته ويثبت الحكم فيما يقطع بانتفائها فيه للمظنة في الأصح. It is permissible to use a ratio legis when the wisdom behind it is not known. A ruling established even if the wisdom behind the ratio legis appears to cease based on an assumption of the existence of the wisdom in the dominant opinion. So we can establish a ruling even if the wisdom behind the ratio legis appears to cease based on an assumption of the existence of the wisdom continuing in the dominant opinion. So first he says it is permissible to use a ratio legis when the wisdom behind it is not known. So the wisdom is not knowing the wisdom behind the ruling, or behind the illah rather, is not a condition. For the exact point is that it is not the reason behind the law, it is a secondary issue. So while it would be nice if we had that, we don't always have to have it. So the example that he gives is, we know that traveling causes traveling a certain distance, that is, causes us to allow to shorten our prayers. One of the wisdoms that we say is that the reason behind that, we say that even in English, the reason behind that is because of the mashaqqa, because of the difficulty of travel. Difficulty of travel is not the illah, it's a wisdom. The illah is that there is a distance established in the hadith literature that tells us if you've passed that distance, then you can shorten your prayer. So the issue, he says, is what happens if you're traveling on a boat and then instantaneously, or in very quick speed, you have already passed the distance of travel, meaning the mashaqqa is gone, the difficulty is gone. So he says a rule that has been established, even if the wisdom behind the ratio legis appears to cease, the ruling still exists because we based on an assumption of the existence of the continuation of the wisdom in the dominant opinion. So maybe the wisdom it was mashaqqa. Maybe it was another type of wisdom behind it. But we don't say, oh, in that case, you can't shorten your prayers because there was no difficulty. That's not the illah. The illah is the distance, the minimal distance has been established. So therefore, in that, what we're doing there is we're assuming that the wisdom has continued in the ruling. I'll pick it up in the next clip, inshallah. All right. Now he's going to talk about al-illah al-qasira, or the limited ratio legis. والأصح جواز التعليل بالقاصرة لكونها محل الحكم أو جزءه أو وصفه الخاصة، ومن فوائدها معرفة المناسبة وتقوية النص. In the dominant opinion, it is permissible to use a limited ratio legis, which is one that does not have multiple applications, since it serves as the object of the ruling, or part of it, or a specific description of it. So, the illah is not always like super universal. Sometimes it can be limited to something. Limiting meaning that it doesn't have multiple applications. Sometimes it has multiple applications, like al-iskar, or becoming intoxicated. That's pretty much, anytime you find iskar, you're going to find that the ruling is it's haram to consume that substance knowingly and willingly. Of course, sometimes you have iskar through medication and through heavy pain medication or something like that. That's different. That's an excused use in the Sharia. Here we're talking about just sort of recreational. And then he says, one does not have multiple, since it serves as the object of the ruling, or part of it, or specific. Where are the examples? Yeah. So, object of the ruling is like saying, we say that there's riba in gold because it is gold, and there's riba in silver because it's silver. So the gold is the object of where the ruling is going to land, and the silver is the object of the ruling when it's going to land. And as Shafi'is, that's a limited illah. It's a limited illah qasira. It's only in gold and silver. An example of the illah being, or the rational legis being a part of it, is that you lose your wudu, anything that anything that exits the private parts. So that's a part of the body, and therefore that will be a partial. The illah deals with part of the body, and then therefore the ruling is you've lost your wudu, or a specific description saying that there is. If there's a description of something, like the examples that he gave in the beginning, saying that the illah can be a description, like the foodstuffs or something like that, and therefore that description of an item would allow the illah to be restricted to where that description is found. So just to repeat that line again, in the dominant opinion, it is permissible to use a limited ratio legis, that is, one that does not have multiple applications, since it serves as the object of the ruling, or part of it, or a specific description of it. And from the benefits of the restricted ratio legis is knowing the relationship between the ruling and its object as a way to strengthen the text. So, when he says it is permissible to use a limited ratio legis, what he's saying is a ta'lil bil-illa al-qasira. It is permissible to establish the ratio legis of something through a restricted ratio legis. In other words, the dominant opinion is we are saying, if somebody says, why is this permissible or why is this haram? And I say, because there's this such and such illah, that illah does not have to be universal. It can be specific. And that's important because it will have significant ramifications, and it's a much more nuanced way of looking at the Sharia. Okay, and then he says, وباسم لقب والمشتق وبعلل شرعية وهو واقع وعكسه جائز وواقع إثباتا كالسرقة ونفيا للحيد. The dominant opinion is that you can do analogy based on names and titles and concepts, or nouns derived linguistically. The dominant opinion is that you can do analogy for one ruling using multiple ratio legis, and in fact it occurs, and the opposite. Finding a ratio legis to multiple rulings is permissible and occurs in cases of establishing acts like in theft, or in cases of preventing acts like in menstruation. Okay, so first he says we can do analogy based on nouns, on names, titles, and concepts. Like, saying the urine of an animal is najis, because it's urine like the urine of a human, because they consume meats, and they're omnivore, something like that. So that's using a noun as the reason of making an analogy with this based on that. Or derived, the mushtaq, the derived nouns, from the Arabic language, of course, in the use of the Quran and the Sunnah. So the derivatives of the words, taking them to the roots and then doing the ishtiqaq and the conjugation, we can make analogy based on that. And then he says, in the dominant opinion, you can do analogy for one ruling using multiple ratio legis, and it occurs. So one illah can produce multiple rulings. And vice versa, one ruling can have multiple illahs. So that's also important, that we're not talking about a singular situation, but a plural situation. Okay, and then he said the example of theft and menstruation. So theft is an illah for the punishment of theft, is also an illah for the financial restoration or the financial compensation. Menstruation is a preventative for multiple things: a prevention for fasting, a prevention for praying, a prevention for intercourse. So one illah can be behind several laws. So I mean, he's just showing you that happens. Okay, and then now we're going to talk about the conditions of ilhaq. We're only going to do the first two, and then he says, rahimahullah, وللإلحاق ألا يكون ثبوتها متأخرا عن ثبوت حكم الأصل عن حكم الأصل في الأصح. So the first condition of ilhaq, which is connecting something via the ratio legis, the establishing of the ratio legis cannot take place after establishing the ruling of the original legal issue in the dominant opinion, because the illah exists and revolves around the ruling in existence and non-existence. So when the illah exists, the ruling exists. When the illah does not exist, as we said, the ruling is suspended. The point is that when you establish the ruling, the illah's got to be there. You can't find the illah 2 months from now and say, okay, I found the illah. Then that's not the illah, that's something else. So it's got to be right there. And then number 2, he says, وَأَلَّا تَعُودَ عَلَى الْأَصْلِ بِالْإِبْطَالِ وَيُجُوزُ عَوْضُهَا بِالتَّخْصِيصِ فِي الْأَصَحِّ غَالِبًا. Connecting an issue via the ratio legis cannot revert back to the original legal issue in negation, but can revert back to the original legal issue to restrict in the dominant meaning. So obviously if it negates it, then it's not the illah, but it can restrict, it can be takhsis. And that's why we talked about this, I think, a little bit in the issue of abrogation in naskh, that some things are not abrogation, they are a form of takhsis. There's a general thing, and then there's something that made it restricted. So the illah can restrict something that's general, but it can't negate it. If it negates it, well, obviously it's not the illah, it negated it. So the whole thing will crumble, the whole legal argument will crumble if the ratio legis you've identified ends up going back to the original issue and negates it. Why? Because we need the illah to match the ratio legis to match the original legal issue, because that's what we're using to be able to make analogy towards the new issue or the branch issue. So if the first one has collapsed, well, the whole legal argument has collapsed. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wasallam. Okay, alhamdulillah, in today's class we began the discussion of the description of the illah or the ratio legis, which is the fourth of the 4 key pillars and concepts, arkan, integral parts of analogy. So we talked about the ratio legis, and we talked about 8 things or types. The ratio legis can be a preventative, it can remove the ruling, so on and so forth. And then we talked about legal wisdom, the hikmah behind a legal ruling, how it's a secondary concept, not the primary. That's not the illah, but it can be with a wisdom that we have. And we talked about if it's a wisdom, then it's got to be a wisdom sort of most of the time, all of the time, that kind of thing. But it is not obligatory to know the wisdom for us to make the legal argument. What we need is the ratio legis. And if for some reason the wisdom had ceased to exist, like an example we gave of traveling, like in a moment you've exceeded the distance of travel, you can't say, oh, well, in that case you can't shorten your prayers because there's no hardship, there's no mashaqqa, because mashaqqa is not the ratio legis, it's not the illah. The illah is that you've traveled the halal distance to travel, then you can shorten your prayers. Then we talked about the limited ratio legis, how it does exist, and you can do ta'leel with that. You can find an illah for a ruling, and that illah is limited. So the illah, in other words, doesn't have to be universal in the sense that it applies for everything. It can be limited to a specific issue, and he gave some examples about like gold and silver and things like that. And then we said that we can make analogy based on names and concepts. We can also do nouns. We can also do analogy based on the conjugation of nouns, the ishtiqaq. And then we said that one illah can produce many laws, and many points of law and one point of law can have multiple illahs. And we gave some examples for that. And then lastly, we started talking about the rules of ilhaq, or connecting legal matters via the ratio legis. We took the first two, which is that number one, it has to be, the ratio legis has to be there with the hukum. It can't come after the hukum, or you can't have the ruling and then the ratio legis is delayed or something like that. That wouldn't work. It has to be the ratio legis produces the hukum. And number two of what we took today, there are going to be 6 of them, by the way. What we just did the first 2 is that the ratio legis can't revert back and negate the original legal issue, because if you did that, you would have in fact nullified your entire legal argument. Okay, those are the major topics. We'll see you back for the next class, inshallah. Wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam. Wa sallallahu ala sayyidina mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.